Hello, my name's Bob Miller. This is one of the Introducing the Bible series of presentations. In this presentation, we want to look at the main people in the first half of the Old Testament and see how they are involved in God's plan to deal with our problems and give us a real hope for the future. The first book of the Bible is Genesis, and its first 11 chapters deal with the early history of our world and tell us that there is illness, pain and death in our world because people didn't listen to what God said and did what they wanted instead. Chapters 12 to 50 look at the lives of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and we see the beginning of God's plan to deal with these problems of illness, pain and death. God has used this record of the descendants of Abraham to communicate his purpose with us. He's given us examples of what happened to people who did and didn't listen to God. Abraham was a father of the Jewish race. Abraham is a contrast to those around him in that he tried his best to do what God told him. God made some far-reaching promises to Abraham which formed the basis of his long-term plan to rescue us from the consequences of our disobedience. We find the first of these promises at the start of Genesis chapter 12. "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Here we can see several promises to Abraham. God would make a great nation of Abraham's descendants, bring benefits on Abraham, and make his reputation great so that he would be a means of bringing benefits on others, bring benefits on those who look favorably on Abraham, bring problems to the one who troubles Abraham, and bring benefits on all the people of the earth through Abraham. We see how these promises were kept as we follow the record of Abraham's descendants through the Bible. These promises, although centered on the Jews and the land of Israel, include people from all nations. This means that we can all be involved in God's long-term plan. When God gave these promises, Abraham was living in Ur of the Chaldees, which was in modern-day Iraq. Archaeologists tell us that Ur was a very civilized city. This means that Abraham would have had a very comfortable lifestyle. But God asked him to leave Ur and to go to a land that he would lead him to. So, with his extended family and flocks, he moved northwest from there, following the river Euphrates. He left the relative comfort of Ur and lived in tents as he travelled. When he reached a place called Haran, now on the Turkish-Syrian border, he seems to have stayed there for quite a while. But when his father died, he left most of his father's family there and continued his nomadic lifestyle, journeying on with his nephew Lot into the land we now know as the land of Israel. So we can see that at God's request, he left behind both his comfortable existence and most of his family. While Abraham was in the land of Canaan at a place called Hebron, God told him that his wife Sarah was going to have a child. At this time, Abraham was about 85 years old, and Sarah, his wife, was well past childbearing age. So it would have seemed highly unlikely that he and his wife would have a family. We read in Genesis 15, "And he, the Lord, brought him outside and said, 'Look towards heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them.' Then he said to him, 'So shall your offspring be.' And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. we can see that Abraham believed God would do what he promised, even though it seemed highly unlikely. We see that this is a quality that God is looking for in those who want to be righteous or right with God. He wants us to accept what he says and believe what he has told us about the past and the future. Amazingly, we go on to see that Sarah had a son when Abraham was 100 and Sarah 90. They named him Isaac. Like his father Abraham, Isaac also was given promises by God. We find later on that similar promises were also made to Isaac's son Jacob. The promises to Jacob are in Genesis 28. God told him, "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed." We can see that this is similar to the promise that God made to Abraham. These three great men of faith were promised, firstly, that God would protect them. Secondly, that they will become a large nation. Thirdly, that they would inherit the land that would later become the land of Israel, and that all mankind would benefit from one of their descendants. This last promise is of great significance for us all, as we'll see later. To continue with the Bible record, Abraham's grandson Jacob went back to his father's family in Syria to find a wife for himself, and he ended up with two wives, Leah and Rachel. Over a period of 20 years, he had 12 children by them and their female servants. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and his children were the start of the nation of Israel, often referred to as the children of Israel. The Bible record then follows the history of Jacob and of Joseph, one of his sons. Joseph was not popular with his 11 brothers, mainly because he was his father's favourite. Their dislike of him grew to the point where they sold him as a slave, and he ended up in Egypt, where he was eventually promoted to become ruler of Egypt before a 7-year famine. During the famine, Joseph was joined by the rest of the children of Israel in Egypt. And so Jacob's family all ended up there. The book of Exodus starts with the children of Israel prospering in Egypt and rapidly growing in numbers. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and his people were afraid that the children of Israel would eventually outnumber the Egyptians, and so they made them slaves and treated them very harshly. We then meet Moses, a man sent by God to rescue the infant nation of Israel from slavery. After several disastrous plagues, the Egyptians finally let the children of Israel go, and Moses led them out of Egypt into the wilderness of Sinai. After 3 months of walking and camping in the desert, the children of Israel arrived at Mount Sinai. This is another important point in God's long-term plan. It was at Sinai that the infant nation of Israel was called by God to become God's special people. Exodus 19 verse 5 and 6 outlines the agreement that God made with the new nation of Israel. "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." God wanted the whole nation to take notice of what he had said and obey him, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did. God tells them that if they do this, they will become a kingdom of priests and a holy or separate nation. Now, a priest is someone who teaches people about God and his principles. So we can see that Israel were agreeing to show to the surrounding nations what God wanted them to know. Unfortunately, they failed to live up to this agreement, as we'll see later. But even though they failed, God's long-term plan would still carry on. Moses told the people that another leader would come whom the people would obey. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. We can see that God is promising a special person who will be listened to. We'll see other information about the coming of this special person as we carry on our journey through the Bible. While they were camped at Sinai, Moses went up into Mount Sinai, where he was given the 10 Commandments and the regulations that ordered the nation's way of life, known as the Law of Moses. This law has had a far-reaching effect on our world. Many of the laws of countries around the world have their roots in this law. After nearly a year at Sinai, we find the children of Israel then continuing their journey. At the end of 2 years, they were on the verge of the land promised to their forefather Abraham. They sent spies into the promised land who came back with a good report of the land itself, but cast doubts on their ability to overcome the inhabitants of the land. They didn't believe that God would help them take possession of the promised land. So he sent the nation back into the wilderness for a further 38 years. At the end of 38 years, their children eventually came back into the borders of the promised land. The book of Joshua tells us how they took possession of the promised land under the leadership of Joshua. The book of Judges tells us that local judges ruled after Joshua died. During this time, a pattern emerged. Enemies came and took over different areas when they ignored what God told them. So he sent judges to those areas to rescue them from their enemies and turn them back to God. When the judge died, they returned to their old ways, so they had more problems from their enemies. The last verse of the book of Judges confirms that they were still not listening to God at the end of this time. It sadly tells us everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The next book in the Bible is Ruth, which tells us about Ruth, a widow from Moab, one of the nations surrounding Israel. When her mother-in-law suggested that she go back to her own land, she said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." We can see that she wanted to remain with her Jewish mother-in-law and adopt the Jewish faith. She eventually became an ancestress of a special person who is promised all through the Old Testament. So we can see that although his plan is communicated through the Jews, anyone else can be involved as well. The books of Samuel start by telling us about Samuel, the last judge. The people turned their backs on him. The Bible tells us that the people said to him, "Behold, you're old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." So God said, "Let them have a king." Their first king, Saul, although a mighty warrior, didn't listen to what God said. When he was killed in battle, he was replaced by King David, who was a contrast to Saul in that he did respect God's message to him. David was another extremely important man in God's long-term plan for everyone. God gave promises to David in the same way he did to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. David was told by God, "When your days are fulfilled to walk with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever." David is here being told at some time after his death, he would have a special descendant who would be permanently established on his throne. At the end of this section, we'll see how this promise ties up with the others we've looked at. King David's reign was very eventful. He was a man who tried to obey God, but the record also shows that he had weaknesses which caused him great problems. His major downfall was in taking another man's wife and having that man killed in an effort to cover things up. He confessed his sins and was forgiven by God, but he lived with the consequences for the rest of his life. Most of his later problems with his sons resulted from his actions at this time. Many of the Psalms were written by David and reflect the mental turmoil he went through. These Psalms are very helpful to us when we have problems in our lives. At the end of his life, David handed over the kingdom to his son Solomon. Then followed a period of peace and great prosperity for the nation of Israel during the reign of King Solomon. In part 2 of this presentation, we'll look at the main people in the rest of the Old Testament who lived after Solomon. To finish off, we'll just summarize what we've looked at in this presentation. We've seen that Abraham listened to what God said and believed that he could do what he said, even though it seemed very unlikely. So God chose Abraham to be the father of the nation through whom his long-term plan would be carried out. That family developed into a large nation. Although God's long-term plan is communicated through the Jews, anyone else can be involved as well. We've seen that God told several important people what a special descendant of Abraham would do. He told Abraham, Isaac and Jacob that he would bring benefits to people from all nations. He told Moses that the people would listen to him. He told David that he would reign on David's throne in Israel. We hope you want to look at more people and see how God's long-term plan develops in the rest of the record of the Old Testament, which we'll look at in part 2 of this presentation. Thank you for listening.